And welcome to today's reflection for Saturday the 15th of October. It's nice to be back. Haven't done a reflection for a number of months. The passage I'm going to read is Acts chapter 25, verse 13 to the end, and it deals with Paul, Festus and King Agrippa. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar." Then Agrippa said to Festus, "Well, I would like to hear this man for myself." And he replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." And the passage continues with the heading, Paul before Agrippa. The next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he had done nothing deserving death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner to Rome without specifying the charges against him." When thinking about this passage, reading and rereading it, I noticed that although this story is all about Paul, there is no part of this text that includes anything that he himself actually said or anything that he himself actually did. It contains a report from Festus to King Agrippa of Paul's conduct at the hearing or the trial which King Agrippa had not seen, and that's earlier in the chapter. When we do hear people speak, then they are principally Festus and Agrippa. Festus was the Roman governor who had taken over from Felix. He had inherited Paul as a prisoner. He was not acquainted with the religious significance of Paul or of Christianity or of the dispute that had Paul and the Jewish leadership against one another. And as we can see from his report to King Agrippa, he was something at a loss what to do. When describing the trial, he said, "Instead, they, the Jewish leaders, had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. He was at a loss but he was sure that this was not a matter deserving death. Not understanding really what was happening and not knowing what charges to issue, he sought the advice of King Agrippa. King Agrippa in this story was the grandson of Herod the Great, the Herod we hear about in the Gospel, and son of King Agrippa I. And this king, King Agrippa, was the Roman designated Jewish leader of the region, and he, King Agrippa II, was the superintendent of the temple in Jerusalem. So he was a powerful Jewish scholar, but also a powerful ally of Rome. When he came to see Festus to greet him on his arrival as the Roman governor and heard about Paul, King Agrippa decided that he would have an audience with him. And it's in that audience the following day that Paul, given license to speak freely, spoke boldly of his life, his conversion to Christianity, and the gospel given to him to proclaim. It seemed to me that these two men each had their own important roles to play in God's plan, and it seems they carried them out probably entirely unwittingly. Festus, the Roman, had followed his rules. He'd followed his legal rules-based system that the Romans had developed, and he followed that in refusing to put Paul to death because of the charges he heard, and in refusing to send him to Jerusalem and requiring him to go to Rome when Paul, as a Roman citizen, made his appeal to be heard by the emperor. Those two decisions made by Festus had kept Paul alive, obviously by not condemning him to death, but also by keeping him in Caesarea, because it seems from around the passage that it was likely that Paul would have been ambushed and killed on the way to Jerusalem, or perhaps in Jerusalem, had the chance presented himself. Festus did not appreciate, I'm sure, his acts when he did them. He was honestly following the Roman law and procedure as he saw it and as he consulted with his council. Agrippa was Jewish and able to understand the conflict between Paul and the Jewish religious leaders and scholars. He chose to listen to Paul himself when offered the chance. It's noteworthy that this opportunity that was provided to Paul was provided to him by God. The decision of Agrippa to listen to Paul when he said, I will hear him for myself, was made without any consultation to Paul. Paul was a prisoner. He may not even have known that Agrippa was in the building. Certainly not would have had no position to demand an audience. When he saw him the next day, Paul spoke boldly, but he was unseen in the passage, and so we know that he had no control. He couldn't demand to see Agrippa. He couldn't influence any of the decisions by Festus. But what we do know is that he never wavered from his calling. He never wavered from his calling to speak the gospel that he'd been given, and he never passed up the opportunity to do so, like in the following chapter when he presents his cause to King Agrippa. It's also interesting to note that in seeking to appeal to Caesar, Paul had ensured that he remained in custody for many years, and until he was eventually taken by sea to Rome. I think it must have been obvious to Paul when he was at his trial with Festus and he was speaking on his own behalf and hearing the charges against him. It must have been obvious that Festus was not going to condemn him to death. By seeking to go to Rome, he did avoid the ambush, potentially, but also extended his imprisonment. It seems to me that it must be the case that Paul, who we know was always close to God in prayer and reading, learning, knew that this was God's will for his life, to travel and to proclaim. And Paul must have felt that God wanted him in Rome and had given him the tools to get there by his appeal. And Paul, having heard that call, undertook it, even though it meant hardship for himself. So 3 characters, 2 important actors in the part who are unwitting, and 1 God's chosen vessel to proclaim the gospel after this time, powerless, but sticking with the plan, trusting God. It's an interesting passage in that sense, that the principal actors who have control are not the obvious heroes of Christianity, and that the hero is emasculated, incarcerated, and at the will of those others, and yet God's will for his life and his actions in Caesarea succeeded. And so could I finish with a prayer thinking about this passage? Dear Lord, please open our eyes to the opportunities to do your will all around us. Help us to remember that these may not always arise in church, and they may involve people who we do not expect. Help us to be close to you, like Paul, to know your will for our lives, like Paul, and to follow that path courageously, like Paul. Amen.